Welcome to this episode of Artist Tales, the podcast that features and celebrates artists from different walks of life. I'm Heather Martin, and I'm speaking with John Biebel, a Rhode Island-based painter who also started the Scented Project in 2015. He is a founding member of the Cambridge, Massachusetts-based Design Research Collective that tackles questions about human interaction with technologies. Welcome, John. It's really good to have you on this episode.
Thank you for asking me. It's great to be here.
So tell me a bit about yourself. I mean, we met through a mutual friend of ours based in London, so really this is the first time I'm meeting you. So
Yes, indeed. Tell me a bit about myself. So you mentioned that I live in Rhode Island, and something interesting I wanted to say about that was I came to this state, which is the smallest state in the United States, which is interesting, and it's mostly coastline, because I moved my studio here. And usually you move your house first and then you find a place to work. But in my case, this was such a great place to get a studio and at a fairly affordable rent that I then decided to move house here. So currently I've been here for a little over 2 years, and I'm doing a lot of different projects. In fact, I think I'm spread out over so many different things, including a new music project I just started, and painting and doing a lot of writing and whatnot. That it's many different things, but it's a nice place to be doing so much at one time.
So where are you originally from?
Not very far. In fact, it's interesting because I've kind of gone in this circle where I'm originally from Connecticut, which is I could get over the border in about 45 minutes, but I lived in southwestern Connecticut, and I realized now it's very close to New York, and I ended up going to college in New York City. So I was only about maybe an hour and 45 minutes away from New York when I grew up, but to me that felt like, it was so far away. And yet it really was quite close. So I had a sort of suburban upbringing, and yet I had this wonderful access to the city so close to me as well, too.
So how did you get into painting?
It's an interesting question. My mom was a painter for some time, but she was a very creative person, and she worked in many media. And she at one point had sort of stopped painting for a while to do some other things. But when I went to college, I went to a school that you, by design, are not supposed to declare a major for your first 2 years. And they're very specific about that, in that they want you to only do their curriculum so that you discover what you want to do as in a natural way. And it's a small private school called the Cooper Union, and it is a very interesting school. A lot of people may not like that curriculum, but it was sort of perfect for me because I needed to be exposed to everything. And so in the process, I just naturally fell into painting, which was great because I don't know if I had to decide that early on, if I would have chosen it, but I did find it was the thing that I was spending my greatest amount of time doing. And I should also add that one of the great parts of the school is that you have a required art history class in which you meet weekly at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And so to be, quote unquote, forced to go to the Met every week is just this unparalleled exposure to art, And so by looking at so much art, it helps to fortify what you want to do. I think you see mirrors of what you would like to do in front of you all the time.
So then I guess you went to university after that?
Yeah, so this was my university, and I know that when I say school, I know I used the wrong. So this was my university experience, and that was a very full 4 years, and it's very rigorous because of course your first 2 years you're pretty much on their schedule, and then you can choose to do what you want, and it's pretty demanding. And I also worked part-time while I was doing school full-time, and yeah, so I came out with a sort of more or less a double major in painting and photography. And photography also was, I don't do as much photography now. It's more of a functional aspect of other things I do, but it really was an important adjunct to what I was doing in painting, in that they were both these very broad fields of exploration for me and for opening up the imagination.
So why did you, if you study both painting and photography, what drew you to painting rather than photography, or doing both?
Well, I think they're very different media for expression. And what I found that was sort of funny about photography is I was doing the exact opposite of what many, at least at that point in time, and even still when I look at a lot of photography now, I think some of the highest regard was given to at least again, that time, this notion of the sort of New York street photographer or even the kind of London street photographer of, catching the kind of Cartier-Bresson perfect moment you just find by walking around. I was doing the exact opposite. I was setting up these sort of complicated dioramas in the studio and I wanted to control everything as opposed to trying to find a magic moment out there. And I started to wonder, am I actually just making paintings with photographs, really? And so in that way, the lines were sort of blurred. And I found in a way that I was getting more out of the process of painting. So that's maybe why photography took a little bit of a backseat, because I had a little bit more creative freedom, I think, with painting, in that I got to sort of call all the shots. Whereas photography, I felt like I was a little bit, the choices were being made by the things that I could put in front of the camera, but it still had a lot that was out of my hands.
So after university, what next? What did you start working on?
I really like this question because I think there's the idealistic thought and then the realism of, hitting the actual world after school. Again, I always say school here in the US, but it was tough for me. And I left university in the early 90s, which was economically was really hard, job wise and whatnot. And I painted I painted like crazy, and I had a few exhibits here and there, but I was without a job for a while. I moved back to Connecticut after living in New York for quite some time. And it was tough. I was sort of back into suburbia, which I never wanted to do. But I did end up with an interesting job after a while. And I worked for a newspaper, and I was just doing sort of graphic work. And then I kind of rose in the ranks, and I ended up doing newspaper illustration, which is, I realize now, I was lucky to have this job. I was never paid as nearly as much as I should have been for the amount of work I was doing. But to be a newspaper illustrator, a lot of people don't get that opportunity. It's a fun job. And you also have to do a lot of critical thinking about how to take ideas about politics and economics and translate them into drawings that kind of paralleled what was going on in the stories to enrich them, if you will. So I was doing that as my job, and then also full-time, and then also painting and trying to exhibit here and there where I could at the same time. So it really was pretty good. I ended up in a good balance of careers for a while at that point. And then I was made redundant in that job, and a lot of strange events happened at once, which opened up this big opportunity. And I came to London for a little while, which is where I met a mutual friend and whatnot. And, that was, of course, very interesting sojourn. And and that's what I love about London, and I think I always will, is that it's such even more so than New York or a lot of other cities, it's such a true kind of a stew of different kinds of people and different talents and people intermingling. And, and before I know it, I was in a band playing a few instruments, and I was like doing writing projects, and I was in so many creative little ventures that were happening among so many people. And I'll always remember, and I had 2 exhibits while I was there, and so there's so much going on, and it was a great experience. It was a great time to be there when I was there.
How long were you in London for?
I wish it could have been longer. It was just for 2 years, about, maybe a little less, but maybe about 18 months to 2 years. But I can't recall exactly now. But it was great when I was there, though. I had, again, it was a very important moment for me culturally. And in so much, I made so many good friends that I've been back numerous times, and it's been pretty important for me.
So what brought you into music? It sounds like you do quite a lot of different things, while you were here.
It's very strange, the music there. I have to say my brother, in a way, because he's always been a musician. He was a bass player. He's been in a number of bands. And he had one of these very old 4-track recorders, which I was always fascinated by. And I remember I took a film class when I was in college, and I decided, well, I may as well try to record a soundtrack for my own film. And I did it on this 4-track, and was really kind of amazed at being able to do that, to actually kind of create a short film and do the soundtrack. And I think there was something about that whole DIY process that, in actually seeing it through to completion, that just really astounded me. Like, wow, I did all of this myself. That's crazy. To have the ability to do that was really pretty fascinating to me. And I always, since then, have loved the feeling of accomplishment you get when you're able to sort of translate an idea involving sound into something that's recorded. It's kind of It's a very lengthy process, though, and it involves a lot of time, and you make a lot of mistakes, and there's, it's a lot of, that's something I have to say about art that's a little difficult, and a lot of people may not know, and not just about music, but other things, is it's a lot of time spent alone with headphones on, listening, or in a studio looking at your own work. And it, by nature, has to involve quite a lot of solitude, and that can be hard. It means when other friends are just out having a lot of fun, you're not. Yeah.
But you found it really worthwhile, like sort of getting involved within.
Yes, absolutely worthwhile. Yep.
And has that influenced you at all with your painting? Some of these other things you've been involved with?
Yeah, absolutely. What I've found a lot of times is painting is sort of this, it's almost like the backdrop to many things. And I don't want to just relegate it to being a backdrop, but it's sort of like a foundational medium for me. It's what I go to as a strength and a comfort and a great place to explore ideas. And it's also, for example, when I go to a museum, I get this unbelievable sense of wonderful. I love looking at paintings, and I never feel more inspired than a few hours in a museum and feeling like I just have to go and paint for a while. I'm so moved by what I've seen. But I have noticed that a lot of other things I get involved with artistically are almost like tributaries of a river that painting is. They are sparked off by things that I enjoyed in painting and I want to explore, but just through a different voice. And so that's how, certain music projects have started. And I do quite a lot of writing as well. And that's been influenced by painting. And then about 6 years ago, I went off on a completely new tangent in which I started making fragrances and perfumes, which is really interesting because I think it's very much a balance of art and science that involves so much chemistry and that sort of knowledge, which I haven't really done prior. And I've noticed the relationship between art and the olfactory senses and smell has been this very rich territory to explore for me. It's been fascinating stuff.
Tell me more about this relationship. What is it?
It's a very uncharted one, and I think that's why I like it. And you will find there are many people right now who are trying to explore this. And you'll see in art galleries and in some magazines that I'm trying to think of a word for it. But for example, one of the band members of the Icelandic band Sigur Rós just made an olfactive smell-based art exhibit that won a few awards. And it's actually becoming into itself a new sort of artistic medium that people are very interested in. But for me, I think what it's doing is there's a lot of associations I think that our brain makes with the sense of smell. And for the person who creates either a recreation of a smell or a perfume that you can wear or something that's sort of ambient in a room, you have this interesting dual purpose of, wanting to create something that emotes certain senses from people. But also you've got to technically figure out how the heck to do it, and they're both great. One's a lofty aspiration and one is a technical exercise. And I realized one day that that's always driven everything that I love to do, are those two things. I love the technical exercise, but I love the final product of also creating something that people respond to in some way. And fragrance is just another very interesting and really unknown version of that. Like, we really don't know how the brain processes smell. We are just at the cusp of understanding that, and how people will smell something and they brought back 20 years to a memory that they can't put a word to. It's a very powerful but abstract medium. So I'm compelled and I want to understand it.
Just listening to you talking about the various aspects of what you do, whether it's the music, whether it's the painting, and how they are all kind of interconnected in some way. It sounds very senses or sensual, if I can use that word, if I'm using that word correctly. And I'm just wondering what your process is in whatever you do. To me, it kind of sounds like there's something about the senses.
Yeah, and I like thinking about it because I often think that there's two ways to do this. And one of them involves a certain level of trust. And I'm glad you say that word senses, because it's really great to hear other people reflect on something like that, because you're probably using better words than I would, right? But it is true. Like, I know that, for example, I was teach a few writing classes because I also write about fragrance. And one of the things a technique that I do for people is I mention that they should attribute a different sense, because we have very few words about smell in English. And I say, well, attribute a different tactile quality to a smell. Like, think of a smell as cold, or think of it as like fuzzy, or think of it as anything that isn't necessarily a smell word, or metallic, things like that. And so you're starting to build these other adjectives and metaphors, whatever, around these senses, but I realize it is this way of expanding our sensory power, right? And I think that I do sometimes see this kind of through line where, for example, a sound to me can sound like this incredible bright whitish yellow that I've seen behind a couple of Degas' portraits, where he makes this unbelievable, almost like startling contrast between a very dark figure in the foreground with this blast of white light behind them, which is sort of like the dazzling light of when you face the sun. And then it kind of reminds me of very certain sort of sounds, that are very sharp and piercing. And I do think there's this kind of funny translation in my head where certain things hit a similar space in the brain, but they're expressed in different ways. And I think as I've gotten older, it's become a little more intuitive that I just start to work in these different ways, thinking, I want this thing that I'm working on to hit a certain spot. And if it's in paint, I kind of know what colors will do that, or I know how to start the experiment with the colors. If it's sound, I kind of know where to kind of begin with. And if it's in fragrance, I kind of have an idea of where I can start. But with some sort of tactile, resonant ideas, and then some other ideas just literally come to me out of nowhere. And I just trust. I say, okay, there's a nugget of something good in that. And I just have to trust it and walk with it for a while and hope that it goes somewhere good.
So it sounds like, there's various aspects to your process when you're kind of working on various aspects of your art. You've kind of touched on it a little bit, around kind of what influences you. So you've mentioned you've gone to museums and that sort of thing. And sort of you might do some sound, which can then influence your painting or that sort of thing. But are there specific things that might trigger something? Or as you say, is something that might be intuitive, but I'm just thinking part of your process, what kind of influences you?
I definitely find there's a lot of external influences that are really powerful for me. And some of them, there's plenty of artists, for example, that I love to watch and follow and have been very influential. And a few that have really stayed steady influences throughout my life. Surprisingly, one big influence for me has been film, which I think because it's one of those media that is so immediate. And I think I've seen some films when I was quite young that have never left my psyche. Like they've always been hovering there. And I find that every couple of years I'll go back to see them again because I feel that they're so vibrant. And I remember in college first seeing the films from Andrei Tarkovsky, the Russian filmmaker, and being I think I was so shocked at how beautiful and poetic, these things can be. And I know for some people, his films are hard to watch because, he'll just have a camera sort of slowly panning the bark of a tree for maybe a full 60 seconds, but to me, it's such a wonderful thing to watch. But, but that I think then and now, I see where there are certain artists or traditions in art that are, I almost see it like, it sounds a little naive, but it's like a piñata. And when you hit it, it bursts open and there's toys and candy inside. It's sort of like reading Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales or something where there's just so much richness in it. Or certain painters, like I was very fortunate to see the Hieronymus Bosch show in the Netherlands that covered almost every piece of his whole life. That was in 2016. And that was a unreal thing because I've been looking at his work since I was a child, and of course that's a tribute to how much detail you can shove into the smallest amount of space. So I think that there's a certain richness of art that I love to see and am influenced by and continually look at. And equally, I find some minimalist artists, just as influential, but I think it's also because I will bring a lot of my own associations to their work. So I would say looking at other art is very important. I also read quite a lot. And, I find the whole idea of narrative very fascinating, particularly things like fable and fairy tale. And yeah, there's so much that we can learn from. And I feel like we never really forget a lot of stuff. And I will notice that as I'm working, these themes will come up that have been pretty much in my head since I was young. And, it gets enriched, but they really stay there for a long time.
So what challenges do you face if you do have any challenges?
A lot. I think the biggest challenge that I face, and this is personal, but I'm sure there must be other artists who do, is they're very practical. And this may sound a little bit like, Virginia Woolf and A Room of One's Own, where it really comes down to money and time. And, the fact that you have a limited time on the planet. And, I've had some nights where I'm just, lying in bed and I think my mind is so awake because there's so many things I want to do. And I'm like, and I say to myself, well, John, just calm down and go to sleep. But, you also want a quality of life. And, some days I still work a full-time job and yet I still paint and I run this fragrance project now, which is doing fairly well. And I still keep taking on new projects. I still do writing and I do some teaching on the side. And, it's a lot of stuff to do. And I guess I must want to do it because I seem to still keep doing it. But I think it's a little bit hard because it may be the fear that by giving up something that you may be failing, and I think I want to always make sure I'm giving as much as I can to each mode of expression. But I also want to be careful that I'm not trying to do everything. It's a tough battle sometimes. So I've been trying to think a little more practically lately of how can I make sure that I am sort of covering the bases that I think are important artistically for me, but not wearing myself out.
Yeah, I think that's a challenge for quite a lot of artists, trying to balance kind of what you do artistically with making a living, as well.
Very true, very true. And I want to add to that too that it's a little bit difficult I would say a little more difficult of a challenge, or I should say it's a different challenge in the US because, a lot of us, although there is sort of a healthcare system that you can pay into here, it's still not really, it's nothing like, a national health system. And so many of us work because we need health insurance. And so we're stuck in a strange, choice of like, and you can't work part-time and get health insurance. You have to work full-time. So you really are, it's like, do you want to live a life where you are not afraid of getting sick, like most normal people should live in the world, and get that security, but also, be able to paint and whatnot. And I've known some people, they've had to literally make that choice, which is a really tough one. Like, should I just go without insurance for a year so I can, be freed up to work on my creative ventures? I mean, I don't want it to sound so political, but I do think that's a very realistic thing that happens to some folks.
Yeah, no, it's a big consideration.
Yeah.
And it can be a challenge, and yeah, you have to you have to do what's right for you, obviously.
Yeah.
But I'm just, and correct me if I'm wrong, do people also commission you to do sort of artwork as well as your kind of day job?
Yeah, definitely. And they're very interesting and they will, some very unexpected things come up too, where I will get, the occasional, some are interesting because they'll be sort of like, well, I have this funny shaped space in my living room. Do you think you might do something for that? And, that's sort of one side of it. And then something very interesting, which I'm sort of glad to have I've never really talked much about this before, but I had a unique opportunity where I live not terribly far from the birthplace of Henry David Thoreau, the writer. And so they at one point had a gallery space, and I was booked about 2 years out to do a number of Thoreau-based paintings. And this really was one of the greatest opportunities for me, just because I really got to dive very deeply into Thoreau and his work and Walden and the pond. And a lot of people don't know this, but you can actually swim in the pond. It's a beautiful place to go, and the woods around it and all that. And so a few years after that, I'm trying to get this right. I think it was the anniversary of his death. Oh, no, sorry. It was the anniversary of the beginning of the Walden period. That's right. And suddenly I was being contacted by all of these magazines across the world saying, because I had painted a portrait of his hut, the famous hut at Walden Pond. And everyone wanted to run this on the cover of their magazine. And so suddenly I was licensing out the image of this painting to numerous magazines, including a magazine in England, which I was quite surprised, and I didn't realize first off, how lucrative that was, which was interesting to me, but also the genuinely positive feedback I got from so many people saying, this is one of the most interesting portraits of Walden we've ever seen. And, thank you for doing this. It's much more atmospheric and intuitive and imagined than your traditional just drawing of the house, if you will, So that was an exciting opportunity. And it did make me realize how it isn't just a transactional thing. You're actually providing something of real value to people in that case. And I really loved that aspect of the whole Thoreau project, if you will.
Yeah, that sounds really quite interesting. And I'm sure you probably got quite a lot of other connections as well out of that.
I did. And it also just created some great relationships with people and understanding. I think it also made me a lot more less pessimistic about that sort of commercial aspect of art, in that, you really are helping people to fill a bigger need than just like, oh, we need something for a cover. They really want something that's going to help enlarge and give interest to what they've written inside and all that. So I came away with a very positive feeling from it. It's really good.
So you mentioned earlier kind of your process of when you're working, it seems quite like a very solitary type of, very focused, very solitary. You just get your head down and get on with it. Do you kind of collaborate with anybody? So if you are working on an art project or putting on an exhibition, would you collaborate or have you collaborated with other artists?
It's a very timely question because I have just recently, for example, started a interesting collaboration with perfumers. So in that realm, I have met someone who is currently at school in Grasse, and he's in France, and he's getting his skill set into wonderful realms right now. But what was interesting prior to that is that I've noticed I haven't done a lot of collaborations. Like I would occasionally did some music collaborations here and there, a few artistic work collaborations, but not a whole lot. And I did say to myself sometimes, like, geez, John, are you actually not too good at working with others? I guess it did strike me as, wow, I ought to be a little more. But I realized that it's more about the energy of the people, and that there are just some people we work really well with. And when I met this Michael Nordstrom, and we just got together for a weekend, and we just banged out a whole bunch of these amazing ideas for fragrances. And I realized, gosh, part of the great thing about collaborating is when you find someone to work with who it's like these two egos do not like cross over each other. Like they literally are just so willing to step back and let someone step in. And I think when you have this give and take of being really grateful for someone's expertise to come in, and then they're equally grateful for your expertise at some other place, that's makes for this really ripe opportunity to collaborate. And I think we just have to seek out the right ones. But what's good about it is it did teach me like it can bring out, it has a synergy to it where something much bigger than the parts comes out. And that's what I think I experienced. And so, yeah, it's definitely something I really want to do more of because there was such a good outcome from it. And I know there will be more of it coming forward for me. Definitely.
Just a slight detour.
Sure.
Because we've touched on quite a lot of your artist stuff, whether it's music, whether it's the painting or the perfume. But I did read on your website, your bio, that you're a founding member of the Design Research Collective based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. What is it, and how did you get involved with that, or how did you found it?
Sure. This has been a lot of fun, and we kind of ebb and flow. Like we're in a bit of a slower period now. A lot of the pandemic has, caused a lot of that. But it began as a attempt. So the sort of full-time job I do is I work in something that's known as, it goes by a couple of names, but it's usually known as UX or user experience design or product design, also known as human factors design. And it's more or less the face of the human involved in different kinds of technologies. And sometimes it also goes into the face of how everyday things are designed, like why is a plate the size that it is, or why are tables the height that they are. That's more kind of human-centered design. But one of the gentlemen who founded, Giles Phillips, who now works for Google out in California, he and I had been colleagues when we worked for a company called Monster.com, which is a job finding site. And he and another colleague of ours, initially we thought, we really want to explore some of these ideas that we are interested in when it comes to humans meeting technology, but in a way that we can't do at our jobs, like the much more interesting questions. So we thought, wouldn't it be great to just get people together to do sort of meetups where we explore ideas and maybe we take on a problem, for example, that we think needs to be investigated. And so we invited all kinds of folks, people who work in, engineers and technology, and some marketing folks or other UX designers. And like sometimes we just ask anyone, like I brought a few yoga instructors to one meeting. And we just sort of get in groups and we do different exercises. And some of them were usually pretty fun. Like a good example was we created how would you create the most efficient way of building paper airplanes? And, who one person would be responsible for doing the folding, one would do the actual aerodynamic design. So it was sort of about like, how do you create a process flow and communicate it, most effectively? But we also were really interested in problems like how distraction is, the distractions of our phones, how it's disrupting our lives so much, how technology is sort of bad. And it was really important for me, and it continues to be, because I think it's the very analytical side of my brain that loves to be stimulated. That is, I've never found it competing with my creative side at all. In fact, it's just another expression of my creativity. It's just in a different way and applied in a more practical sense. But and I still use it every day in my full-time job. And I'm really grateful in a way to have these two avenues of expression. I don't know if I'd want to get rid of that one fully, even if I could have the luxury of just painting all day. It might be a little bit too much to do that.
I was going to ask you how it actually influences kind of other aspects of your creativity.
Yeah, it's been great for me, because I know that there's a lot of these sort of sparks and moments that occur when we are doing these meetups and these projects with other folks. And I think anytime you're exposed to like almost like strangers who come in to speak to you, it's always great, because you have this unknown voice that's suddenly saying things, and you, oh wow, I never would have thought of that. I mean, even amongst friends, we tend to know each other's language, right? And people will say things that really open up your brain. And I remember, for example, we had one evening where we were doing projections into the future of, we asked the question of, what would a world without money look like? I think it was something along those lines. And we wanted a sort of utopian projection and then a sort of dystopian projection. And I remember this one young woman who came up with the wildest ideas, where she was saying how people would have to learn how to write code, and that would be the money of the world. So you'd be sort of locked in a box just typing out code for, major corporations, and that's the only way you could eat. Which I thought was just, it was crazy, terrible dystopian view. But that little nugget reminded me so much of like a very Dickensian kind of world, right? Of, almost a return to, industrial revolution and, that kind of like child labor and stuff. And I thought, gosh, isn't it funny that we've never left that sort of, when we think of the future, there's always this grimy underside to it. And it's always kind of stuck in my head as a very visual, very potent visual metaphor.
What has the pandemic and COVID, how has that affected you?
It had a fairly profound impact on me. I want to start by saying I was somewhat fortunate, because my studio building, which is about 10 minutes drive from my house, had a one of the companies in it was considered an essential service, and so the whole building had to remain open. So I was able to access my studio throughout the pandemic, which I realized is I'm quite fortunate to have that. But what did occur was, and I mentioned this when speaking to some friends, is that I did sort of begin to feel like I was living in a very strange bubble of just my home and the studio. And I would work, I mean, every one of my communications, much like the rest of us, was through a computer screen. And I would work from, my home to my studio and back, and I would see no one, virtually. And what I found was both helpful and very strange is that I was getting no external feedback at all about anything I was doing, except for the occasional phone call or video chat with someone. But it's not as if I could really get other people involved and say, oh, do you want to see what I'm working on, or what? It wouldn't be practical to do that. So even though I did say I would work in solitude, there was something so surreal about having no audience whatsoever for what I was doing, that I would say it brought about a lot of like it was so internalized reflection on my work. But it was getting harder to work, though, because of the fact that all I could really do was just sort of look out at the very quiet landscape, and I didn't have much to kind of compare it to, and I wasn't getting much stimuli back in, except for like reading the news online or occasionally watching TV. So I think I'm going to look back on it as a time where I did a lot of work, but I'm not sure quite yet how I'm going to assess all that work, because it's always going to feel like there's a bit of an asterisk to it, And I wonder, in talking to other artists, it's going to be interesting to hear what other artists that you interview say about this, because I'm wondering if they've had a similar experience. So yeah, I guess history will tell us really what does the work of that year look like. Will be quite interesting, won't it?
Yeah, well, yeah, I know it's influenced because I'm into photography, and I know it's influenced my photography, and yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So what's next? I mean, it sounds like you have various aspects of kind of your creativeness and different outlets and things. So what's next?
I think I paused just slightly because I'm genuinely at a stage now where I'm thinking a bit about sort of how I I split my time and what I'd like to do with it. It's been a fairly recent thing to start recording music again, and I've really enjoyed that part. And I think I really want to massage that a bit more, and I think that'll be something that becomes more active. But I would really like to do some things in which I combine some of the things that are most active for me. So right now it's basically painting and music and making fragrances. And I'd like to do some exhibits that actually involve a few of these things. And I just have to think of ways to do it. So, but I like that technical challenge. And I like that it's sort of time based. So it's a little more sort of performative, which I've honestly not done a lot of that before. So it's kind of, that's again, more new territory for me. So, and it's kind of a great return to the question you asked about collaboration, because I think it would by necessity involve a little collaboration with other people. So, maybe that'll get me out of my shell of being so much in solitude, and I might have to collaborate with some folks to do that.
Yeah, and it also makes me think about what we were talking about, the senses, like kind of incorporating senses.
No, you're absolutely right. It would involve that, wouldn't it? It's a very good point. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you. I really appreciate your time. It was really lovely meeting you.
It's extremely great to meet you as well. And I appreciate these questions. They've been very helpful for me to kind of as jumping off points to some very good ideas. So it's been a great pleasure talking to you.
Great. And it's been a pleasure talking to you as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Artist Tales. I hope you enjoyed listening to it. Further information about the artist I spoke with is in the episode notes. Please rate and review this podcast on the apps and spread the word. You can get in touch by emailing artisttalespodcast@gmail.com. This podcast is on social media. Check the information in the episode notes. Hope you join me next episode